Well, welcome to Austin. Welcome to the capital of the Lone Star State. Again, my name is Laura Jorgensen. I'm here with Tipster Tours. We are a tip-based free walking tour company in Austin, the first of our kind here in town, although inspired by those that I've gotten in other cities in the past. Now, if you've ever been on a tip-based tour, or if you haven't, you might wonder, why would we do free tours in the first place? Well, a couple reasons. One being, of course, that we love our city, true local experience of our city, and regardless of what your budget is when you come to Austin or when you join us on the internet, we want to make sure that you really get to see an authentic side of Austin, hear a little bit about its history, present, future, and hopefully, well, enjoy your time here. So that's really what I'm here to do. We've got donation links in the description, so if you do enjoy yourself,
we can't help but look at this.
Absolutely, yes, let's go for it. Yes, take a look.
Thank you guys. The world is watching.
Yeah, cool guys. Well, this is one of the reasons why I love starting tours at the Capitol, because you will find all different kinds of people here expressing all different kinds of ideas. So it's really an amazing place to get a sense of how diverse Texas really is. Let's head over this way. This actually opens up a great opportunity to talk a little bit more about the history of Texas and of Austin specifically. I guess I cut my intro a little short there, so hi to everyone who's still just joining us. Again, I'm Laura with Tipster Tours from here in Austin. Now, I'm actually not a born and raised Austinite myself. I am originally from the Seattle area, but I came to Austin for grad school about 8 years ago and completely fell in love with the city and with a local musician as well, who is now my fiance. So great reasons to stay for sure, but it's a pretty common theme these days. Austin is a fast-growing city. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But I hope that y'all will also enjoy visiting us today in the capital of Texas. Now we are headed over here towards the Tehana Memorial, which many of y'all may know. Texas, or Tejas as it was known at the time, was a part of Mexico when they declared independence from Spain in the early 19th century. Now prior to that, of course, it was inhabited as well by a number of indigenous tribes here who were settled right in this area. But the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, the French were not long behind, and of course the United States eventually was vying for power in this area as well. But Tejas, a state of Mexico in the early 19th century, that heritage is still very present here today. And we can see here the Tehana Memorial, recognizing those settlers from Mexico who came into the area at the time. But there were also a lot of Americans coming into the area at the time, and that was partially because, well, Mexico really wanted to kind of speed up the settlement process of the area. So they really liberalized their immigration policies and actually started to recruit Americans to come here as well. Now, they called themselves Texians when they got here. And, there were some tensions between the Tejanos and the Texians at times, one of which was a language barrier, as many Texians didn't speak Spanish and many Tejanos didn't speak English. But there was also another issue, which was that in the 1820s, Mexico was in the process of abolishing slavery. And many of the Americans moving here didn't really want to abide by those rules. So ironically, in 1830, Mexico did actually ban the further immigration of Americans, specifically into Tejas. It's a little funny to consider that part of our history nowadays, given everything that's happened since. But, they kind of ignored the ban. They just kept coming in anyway. And by the mid-1830s, Texians outnumbered Tejanos around here by about 4-1 and decided they didn't want to be a part of Mexico. They wanted their independence, and so they went to war. In 1836, after, well, some major losses like the Battle of the Alamo, and then a really dramatic turnaround, the Texians actually were able to establish their independence, declare themselves as the Republic of Texas, and they remained an independent country for about 10 years until 1845, when they did vote to become a state, mostly because, well, their country wasn't recognized by many other nations, which made their currency essentially worthless for international trade. Now, we can still see the importance of that Spanish and that Mexican heritage reflected here. And we're gonna kind of head out of the grounds here, see a little bit more of downtown.
Did you guys have a favorite statue there? Was there one of them that you liked more than the others? Were you more with the Spanish conquistador up there? Or were you more of a fan of one of them steers that Texas is so famous for?
Those are our longhorns.
Let us know in the chat, guys. Tell us in the chat which ones you like. What statue was your favorite statue there?
You know, I think I'm most affiliated with that young girl just hanging out, waiting to see what the future holds for Texas. Now, we've got a little bit more of a controversial monument here that we're heading towards. Of course, in the last few years across the United States, a lot of Confederate memorials have been taken down. But here on the Texas State grounds, we still have 11 of them up. This one in the most prominent position. And for now, the state does say they intend to leave these up as a way to reflect a certain period and perspective from American history. So let us know what y'all think. I know it's a very controversial topic, but we can see here recognition of the fact that Texas did participate in the Civil War on behalf of the Confederacy, which was actually itself a pretty controversial decision at the time. Now, Sam Houston was a very important political figure in Texan history. He was one of those who led the Texans to victory and independence, was their first president, later governor when they became a state. And as governor, when the Civil War began, he really did not want to get involved. Texas was so far removed from the battlegrounds at the time, he figured they should stay completely out of it. But his lieutenant governor did not agree. He was a big Confederate supporter. And so he actually ousted Sam Houston from power and led the Texans to war. Now, this Confederate monument, like many around the country, was actually installed about 50 years after the war ended by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And whether it should still be here or not is definitely a subject that is often up for debate. So again, let us know what you think. But we've also,
That's not Abraham Lincoln up there.
That is not Abraham Lincoln. A lot of people do ask that question. It does kind of look like him, but no, that is Jefferson Davis, actually.
Ah, okay, the other guy.
Yes. If we head around this way, though, we're going to see our favorite monument here on the grounds. It's a newer addition. And hey to those just joining us. Now, I'm not talking about this volunteer fireman here, although the volunteer firemen did play an especially important role in the city of Austin. And that's because Austin's fire force was actually completely volunteer until 1916. So until that point, you had businessmen, cattle ranchers, all kinds of people volunteering as our fire force. But as we'll hear a couple times along the tour, fire was a pretty big issue in Austin in the late 19th century. And so these firemen were very important to our city.
Where does water come from in Austin? Is it like a river or a natural spring?
Yeah, great question. Well, we've got the Colorado River running through the city. It's not the big Colorado River, actually. It's a smaller Colorado River, misnamed that way by settlers who thought they'd gotten to the Colorado River, but just hadn't quite made it far enough west yet. So yeah, we've got our own Colorado River here in town, and we're part of this incredible aquifer in Central Texas that provides our fresh water. But you know, Austin was actually pretty late to the game in getting fire hydrants. So that was definitely one of the main issues for firefighters in the late 19th century. There just wasn't water readily available throughout town for them to fight fires with. But returning to the idea of the diversity of Texas, the importance of the history of its different peoples, and to the Civil War as well, we've got this newer monument here on our grounds. This one's about 5 years old. It's our beautiful African American History Memorial. This was sculpted by a man named Ed Dwight, who really has an amazing story. Back in the 1960s, he was in the Air Force, and he was the first African American who was tapped to train as an astronaut. But he actually did not get to go into space himself. He left the Air Force because of what he saw as racial discrimination that he was facing there, and then went on to develop an amazing career as a sculptor instead. So you'll find pieces of his at lots of state capitals all over the country. And here we can see a long history of African Americans here in Texas.
Is he the sculptor for this memorial?
Yes, he was, yes.
So actually this astronaut is not just the astronaut, but he's the sculptor.
Well, so this is actually not Ed Dwight himself,
sorry.
because he didn't get to go into space, but he did choose to include, of course, a representation of the first Black astronaut who did. As well as you can see on that side of, since we're looking over here, representation of many of the important people who have contributed to Texas culture, to music, to education, to sciences, sports, and some of the important legal cases as well. Now, many of us are familiar with the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated education in the United States. But not as many people are familiar with a case that preceded it and actually set a versus Painter. And Mr. Sweat, he was a student who was interested in studying at UT Law. But when he applied, he was actually declined admission, even though he had an incredible resume, and he was told that he could attend the separate but equal school for Black law students in Houston. But he argued in the courts that that law school in Houston was not equal to UT's law school. It didn't have the quality of faculty, didn't have the access to resources, and so argued that that was not truly separate but equal. He won that case, and again, like I mentioned, that set up for success for Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate elementary and high school education as well. But coming over to this side of the sculpture, we again trace our history back much further, all the way back actually to the arrival of Spanish colonizers in the 1500s, who brought the first people in slavery from North Africa with them here. And we can see during the era of slavery that 3 of the main industries of Texas were built. We see here a man passing a bale of cotton over the top of the sculpture. And if we come around the back, we'll see where he's passing it to. So cotton, one of the main industries of Texas, along with cattle and oil, that have really built us into a very prosperous state today. So Ed Dwight was intending to represent, with that passage of the bale of cotton over the top of the sculpture, that it was really that labor provided by people in slavery, that it was their work that really built the foundation that Texas is on and really built the prosperous state that we are today. So that labor is incredibly important, but we also have to recognize, of course, the difficult history behind it and the fact that that labor was not provided willingly. We also have here recognition of the Black soldiers who fought for independence for the Republic of Texas in 1836. They took part in many important battles, including some big losses for Texas, like the Battle of Goliad. But unfortunately, we're not really recognized fairly for fighting. In fact, every soldier that fought for independence for Texas was promised that they would receive land, a place to settle once independence was established. And for the Black soldiers, that land was really not readily given as it was for the white soldiers. They had to fight in the courts. They also plead for their freedom because in Mexico, as we learned, slavery had already been criminalized, had been made illegal. So when the Republic of Texas was reestablished, it was brought back, and even those who had fought for independence had to go to this new government and get their freedom papers to prove that they really were able to live freely here, which is one of the reasons why, well, Texas's position in the Civil War was such an interesting one. Being geographically removed from the rest of the country at the time Many people fleeing from the battleground states in the East came here to Texas during the Civil War, brought even more people here in slavery with them. And by the end of the war, we had about 250,000 people in slavery in Texas, which is why our Emancipation Day of June 19th, 1865, is such an important day that's so widely celebrated here. That was the first day that Union soldiers arrived at the borders of Texas to begin enforcing emancipation. It was almost 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was given. So we were pretty late to the game, and there were a lot of people here to emancipate. Hence, its celebration as one of the most important days in our calendar here in town. But we're gonna head off the Capitol grounds now, see a little bit more downtown.
Shannon just joined. Hey Shannon, great to, or maybe not didn't just join, but Shannon just said hi and said so detailed, love it. My question to Shannon is, Shannon, are you talking about Laura's incredible presentation and detailed overview of history, or are you talking about that monument that we just visited? Which one, or both, in fact?
All right, we're gonna head across the street here. But as I mentioned earlier, this Capitol is actually the third Capitol building that Austin has had. When the city was first established in 1839, yeah, thanks Shannon, both the sculptures and the history. You know, the sculpture is, again, like I mentioned, my favorite on the Capitol grounds. I think it's such an incredible representation of such an important part of our history that historically has been fairly overlooked. So I'm glad that we have that here on our Capitol grounds now. But again, third Capitol building that we've had here in town. Now, Austin was established in 1839, a few years after Texas achieved independence. And actually leading up to that point, there had already been a lot of debate about where the Capitol should be. Now, Sam Houston, who I mentioned earlier, one of those who led the Texans to victory and independence, he was their first president. And unsurprisingly, he argued that his namesake city, Houston, should be the capital. And it was the most established city in Texas at the time, so it made sense. But his political rival, Mirabeau Lamar, had a different idea, which is that they should build a bespoke capital city from the ground up. They could make it grand and beautiful. And after camping out here, he actually specifically chose this location himself, on the banks of the Colorado River, with a hill leading up to where the beautiful grand capital would be. But yeah, we are going to go in here in a minute. But first, their original Capitol building was actually just a big log cabin. 2 rooms, one for the House, one for the Senate, built out of wood. That was it. It was a few blocks away. It doesn't stand any longer. But after becoming a state in 1845, they did build a limestone Capitol building here in Capitol Square. Lasted for about 30 years. But didn't treat them very well. It was kind of an ugly building, actually. One of its main issues was that our local limestone has a lot of traces of iron in it. So it actually rusted and discolored over time. And then in the early 1880s, it burnt right down because our limestone is so porous around here. When you fill it with wooden furniture and set it on fire, it tends to just crumble. So as I mentioned before we got the tour started, they had actually already decided to replace that ugly old Capitol building, held a big design competition, selected this design by architect Elijah Myers, and they were ready to begin building, but they hadn't yet. So they were in a bit of a bind. The state government needed somewhere to go. And they came here, right across the street actually. And you can see here the ruins of a building which was very cheaply, shoddily, and quickly thrown up to temporarily house the state government while our big sunset red granite Capitol was under construction. So this building did last long enough to house the state government in that interim period. And then it actually housed Austin High School, business offices, and places for music lessons. But in 1899, guess what? It also burnt right down. And that actually was a big event. A lot of people gathered in the Capitol grounds to watch the destruction of this building. And you know, it actually sounds like it was a pretty exciting day. Would you go watch a fire if a major building in your city was burning down? I don't know. Maybe the culture was a little bit different back then. But I read accounts of high schoolers doing handstands and cartwheels in the Capitol yard as their school burnt, so they seemed pretty excited about it. But actually, we're pretty lucky that we can still see these ruins, that we have this nice little park here today. because actually after the building burnt, it was a park for a little while, and then this area was actually paved over and used as a parking lot. But by the 1970s, historic preservation was starting to become a little bit more of a concern for people in Austin. And this building here was actually slated to be demolished. Now, this building is from 1876. It was built by a Swedish immigrant, Charles Lundberg, and he opened a bakery here, which for 60 years was the most popular place for not only the government officials, but all the locals of Austin to buy their delicious bread and pastries. But after the bakery closed down, well, the future of the building was unclear. But fortunately, it was rescued by a team of historical preservationists who also argued that we should tear up the parking lot, excavate this lot, and bring these ruins back to being a park, which I think was a pretty great idea. Just want to get y'all a chance to look at the beautiful front of this building. Then we're actually going to head up the hill here towards the governor's mansion. But just note that this is definitely worth a visit if you do come to Austin. The old bakery now houses a really cool little visitor center with some exhibitions about Austin history, an art gallery with work by local artists, and of course a store where you can take home some of those locally made crafts yourself.
What do these symbols on the wall here mean?
Yeah, great question. So these, as you can see, are from the Texas Historical Commission. So these designate buildings that are historic and preserved here in Austin. Now, again, this is something that we're pretty lucky to have because in the mid-20th century, historical preservation wasn't as popular. In the 1950s and 60s, you know, a lot of people didn't love these old buildings. They were considered old-fashioned. They were really expensive to maintain, and many of them were covered up or torn down. But luckily by the 1970s, the tide was turning, and every historic building remaining left on Congress Avenue in good shape was actually designated a historic site. The street itself from 1st to 11th is designated a historic district. And so luckily these days we have protected these buildings to enjoy for the future. Now we've got a great question from Jack Anderson here on the chat. Now for those of you who don't know, Jack would actually be very good at this job. He is a great radio host here on KUTX, which, if you're not in Austin, you may not know the radio station KUTX. You can listen to it online though from anywhere in the world, and I highly recommend that you do so. Because as you might know, we are the live music capital of the world. We have an incredible, diverse music scene here in Austin, and KUTX is definitely one of the best places to explore that scene from afar. They play a lot of great local music. Jack is actually responsible for the Song of the Day, which always features a new song by an awesome Austin artist. So check out his work on KUTX.
Nice plug. Sterling Stefan also reached out to say, great presentation.
Thank you.
So detailed.
That is my fiance, so he's a little biased, but you know.
Sorry for not having called him out sooner.
Also to shout him out though, the reason I definitely permanently stayed in Austin, and he's a local musician himself, so if you've ever been out to see a show in Austin, there's a pretty good chance that you've seen him play saxophone.
Cool.
But I want to kind of turn slowly here back towards the Capitol, get one more great view as we head up this little hill, and point out one of the buildings that actually started the whole historical preservation debate in the first place. Now here, right outside the west gate of the Capitol grounds, is the Westgate Tower. It was built in the mid-1960s. It was the first mixed-use commercial, retail, office, and residential building in Austin. But its construction was pretty controversial. It was the tallest building, especially so close to the Capitol. Locals were worried that it would block the Capitol views. And a lot of the state government officials thought it would be an eyesore. They fought tooth and nail against it, but in the end couldn't keep it from being built. And funnily enough, after it was finished, several of those same state officials did end up buying condos and moving in.
A couple quick questions coming in if you've got a second.
Yeah.
I'll come close to you so I can get picked up on the mic, or you can just read them off. Teague asking, historical buildings, stunning. What are some good local foods, barbecue, such as that?
Oh, yes.
And where would you go out? And then Ross writes from Edinburgh, how big is Austin when compared to other cities in Texas?
Both great questions.
A couple of things for you to...
Yeah, so good barbecue, just to list off a few. You know, Franklin's is the most famous one. It's good, but if you don't want to wait in line for hours and get there at 8:30 in the morning, like one of my friends did for her birthday party a couple years ago, then there are some other definitely good places that you can check out. Actually, just a few blocks away from Franklin's is another little family-owned truck called Micklethwaite Craft Meats. That's a great place. Out in East Austin, you've got La Barbecue. Down south by Zilker Park, you have Terry Black's Barbecue. And then, of course, if you're willing to do a day trip out of town, that's where you really get good. Lots of places in the hill country and between here and Houston in tiny little towns where you'll find amazing barbecue.
You've been to Salt Lake?
Salt Lake is such a good one. Classic, you know, just outside of day trip to Austin place. And out in that area, you'll also have a lot of distilleries, wineries, breweries, so very easy to make a little day trip, drink, eat, enjoy all that Texas has to offer. And how big is Texas compared to other cities or Austin compared to other cities in Texas? Great question too. We are technically the 4th biggest city in in Texas. Houston is the biggest. Dallas, if you combine it with the Fort Worth area, ends up being 2nd. Then you got San Antonio. So we come in 4th on that list, but we're actually, well, all the cities in Texas are growing pretty quickly. We are the fastest growing though, and we are actually one of the fastest growing cities in the entire United States, have been for over 20 years, but we've especially picked up speed in the last few years. Here they estimate we've got about 170 people moving to Austin on a daily basis now. So while Austin has about doubled in size approximately every 20 years since it was first founded, if we keep up at this rate, we will more than double in the next 20 years or less. But currently we're at a little over 1 million people in the city, 2.5 million in the metro area. But yeah, we are growing really quickly. We'll talk a little bit more about that along the way as well. But while we're here, I want to tell you guys about the beautiful governor's mansion. So this place was finished in 1856. It has hosted every single Texas governor since then. Sam Houston was one of the first to live here, and some say he is still hanging out where we do still have his old bed. Now, sometimes we are so lucky as to see the governor's golden retrievers, Peaches and Pancake, here outside. Not seeing them right now, but you can follow them on Twitter if you want to know what they're up to. It is still the residence of the governor, Greg Abbott, these days. But 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, in 2008, Rick Perry lived here. And at the time, the mansion needed some updates and renovations. And so the Perry family had to move out. All the historic furniture and artwork was put into storage. And that summer, 2008, somebody actually came and threw a Molotov cocktail from all the way out here on the street, straight into the front window of the mansion. Started a big fire, part of the roof collapsed. It was a, big disaster. All of a sudden they needed a much bigger renovation budget. People flooded in donations from all over the state to rescue and salvage the building. Luckily they did a pretty good job with that, I would say.
How far would you say that throw is?
Oh gosh, I don't even know. But of course, there are a lot of theories about who might have been responsible because nobody was ever actually arrested for this crime. So one theory that I would say is probably a pretty good one is that it must have been a football player to have an arm like that. And there's actually another reason behind that theory too. They did have some security footage of the person responsible for this, but didn't do much to help them identify him because it was a white man of average height wearing a Texas Longhorns cap. Which the Longhorns are the mascot of our local football team at UT. And, pretty much everybody in town has one of those caps. So, it's still a mystery to this day. Probably always will be at this point. But we're gonna head here towards another really interesting building that has a much lesser known interesting history actually. It's this cool Art Deco building here on the corner next to the governor's mansion. Now,
Jack Anderson says, by the way, Sosa says hi.
Ah, Sosa. Hi, Sosa. Sosa's one of my favorite cats in the world.
Shannon also shouts out Peaches and Pancakes. I think those
Oh,
are
yes.
great names for dogs.
I totally agree. It's always fun, especially on morning tours. They often are out on the yard. They'll come right out to the gate and say hello to us. I haven't seen them in a while, so I really miss them. But yes, love the dogs, the first dogs of Texas. And yeah, so we've got this really cool building across the street here. Now, not many people know what the history of this building is, because for a long time now, it's been a state government office like a lot of the other buildings in this neighborhood. But when it was actually built in 1941, well, there's a good story behind it. So in the late 90s, perhaps, or that's 1890s. Wait, sorry, no, I'm getting confused here. 1930s, we're talking about the 1930s.
Art Deco.
Of course. So in the late 1930s, perhaps the richest man in Texas was a guy named Jim West. He was in lumber and cattle, and he also had a lot of very strong political opinions. Particularly, he was a very outspoken supporter of the very unpopular Governor McDaniel at that time. And he really wanted to see his political views and his support for the governor better reflected in the media. So he decided to do it himself. So he actually bought a number of radio stations and the remains of a defunct daily publication, which he revived as the Austin Daily Tribune in 1939. Now if we head across the street here, get a closer look. This building, like I said, was finished in 1941, and it was built especially to house these newspaper presses, their offices, and on the top floor, a beautiful penthouse for Mr. West himself. And you can see he actually specifically asked the architect to include these porthole windows down the side, which point towards the Capitol building, so he and his team could keep an eye on the state government at all times. But poor Mr. West actually did not live long enough to see much come of his newspaper. He died that same year of a bad cold, and of course that was right around the time that the United States was entering World War II. So a lot of his reporters in the next year after he died ended up being drafted, and by December 1942, the publication. If you ask most Austinites, they won't even know anything about the Austin Daily Tribune and its very brief life here in town as a daily newspaper. And as I mentioned, it's state government offices that now occupy that building. Although when they moved in, they apparently had an awkward time explaining what's been described as Playboy bathroom of the penthouse. Not very well suited for a state office. But we're coming around here to get another great view of the Capitol and the side of the old Bakery and Emporium, which also has a nice little cafe garden out the side. They're not open yet right now, but hopefully by the time y'all get to Austin in person, they will be.
Like they're not open because it's too early in the day, or they're not open because of COVID?
Because of COVID, yeah. They haven't reopened during COVID yet, and I believe they're actually doing some renovations inside right now, so that might be delaying them too. But while we're heading down to Congress Avenue here, let us know, what have you seen so far that would make you the most excited to visit Austin? Anything here that's kind of sparking your interest so far for those of you who haven't been to town? And since I know there are some local Austinites on here, have I told you anything yet that you don't know?
Or anything that you'd say that she got wrong?
Oh yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
Put it in the chat. We want your comments. Your comments let other people help other people find this video as a live stream right now, but also as a video later on. If someone's watching later on, they'll be able to find us easier based upon your comments.
Now we're across the street here, but if we can zoom in a little bit, Chris, on those flowers over there, I just want to show off our beautiful Texas bluebonnet for a second.
I'll zoom over to them.
Yeah, we'll zoom over there. You know, bluebonnets are one of our most common Texan wildflowers, and part of that is thanks to former First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson. Now, of course, President Lyndon B. Johnson and Lady Bird were both Central Texans themselves, and as First Lady, and then after her term as First Lady, one thing that Lady Bird was very passionate about was Texas plant life. And many of her personal projects and initiatives had to do with beautifying the city of. And one of those was her wildflower campaign to plant beautiful wildflowers all along the roadways of Central Texas. She also planted many live oak trees here downtown on Congress Avenue. We'll see a whole bunch of them. We'll pass by them on our way down the street here. But this is the prime time of year to come and visit Austin when the weather is great, it's not too hot, you've got all of these beautiful wildflowers blooming. And actually down in South Austin we have the Lady Bird Wildflower Center, where you can see them all in their full glory.
Beautiful bees as well.
Oh yeah, love the bees.
Shannon says hi bee. Carla says Sterling playing sax is my favorite thing.
Oh yeah.
Kristen says live music.
Yes.
Shannon says the fact that we can.
Absolutely.
That's her favorite thing about Austin so far.
Even a t-shirt, honestly, today is a little humid. You might see me a little shiny. You know, it gets hot here in the summer, but I would rather be hot than cold any day. We can catch a quick glimpse down the street of our beautiful seat of the local Archdiocese of the Catholic Church. That's St. Mary's Cathedral. It's the oldest Catholic church around. Beautiful old neo-Gothic building. And we're gonna head our way down Congress Avenue here. So Congress Avenue is kind of the main street of Texas. Like I mentioned, when Lamar established the city of Austin to be this grand bespoke capital of their new country, he argued that they should have a big avenue leading from what would eventually be the site of the Capitol, wasn't quite yet at that time, all the way down to the Colorado River. And so that's exactly what Congress Avenue was. And you know, today it's definitely sort of a government, business, and cultural center of town, but it wasn't always so grand. 1930s and through the 40s, 50s, 60s, Austin was still basically a pretty small frontier town. And Congress Avenue actually was just a big old stretch of red dirt road. And it still have herds of cattle and horses that were run up here all the time, kicking up big red clouds. And in fact, in the early days of Austin, the way that you actually secured a plot right here on the very desirable property of Congress Avenue was just to settle there and squat for a long enough period of time that you could claim it as your own. So nowadays things have changed a bit, although Congress Avenue wasn't paved until 1905. So even for almost 20 years after the big grand Capitol was built, there were still all those horses and cattle running around kicking up dust through here.
Ross has a quick question.
Yeah.
As we walk away from the Capitol, are there guided tours inside of the state Capitol?
Absolutely, good question. So them return before too long, but yes, typically they do have a free tour that they offer. It's about 40 minutes inside the Capitol. It leaves regularly throughout the day. So when you do get a chance to come to Austin, I highly recommend adding that to your itinerary. You'll get to see the beautiful building. You can also visit it yourself. You can grab a brochure for a self-guided tour if you prefer that kind of thing. But the guided tours are definitely great and they're free, so no reason not to.
Do the tips go to Governor Abbott?
I don't believe it's actually common to tip for those tours because those are actually State Preservation Board employees.
Just a free tour guide joke.
Just a free tour guide joke. Before we get too far down the block here though, I want to point out a couple things. So we just saw a great example of a mural, some amazing street art in Austin. That's a big part of our local culture here. You will see a lot of incredible street art. But I also want to point out some of these cool historic buildings that we're walking by because these are some of the oldest buildings still left on Congress Avenue, dating back to the 1870s. Now, as I mentioned, especially mid-20th century, historic buildings weren't all the rage, so many of them were torn down, but luckily these are some that did survive. And back in the 1870s, Austin was just kind of beginning to grow, and it was when actually it was permanently declared the final capital of Texas, because there had still been debate going on since 1839 on that topic. But this was touted as being the most beautiful business block in Austin while it was being built, and it was designed by perhaps the first architect in Austin, or at least the first one who was listed as an architect in the city directory. His name was Jacob Larmore, so the Larmore block. And today you'll see it houses restaurants, shops. Actually, where this boutique is right here, this used to be a livery stable. So if you can imagine, it went from housing horses back in the old days to now housing a cute little store. Now, Congress Avenue has kind of been through a lot of phases over the years. In the 1800s, it was the center business district of Austin. By the mid-20th century, it was kind of in that period of change where these old buildings were falling out of style, new ones were being built, and then in the 70s, like I mentioned, it was designated as a historic district. The older buildings were preserved, but one sort of catch to that was that a lot of restrictions were put into place about how you could redevelop these old buildings. And, you know, not all of them have quite gotten there yet. Across the street, we've got an interesting example of 3 older buildings which you'll see have some work to be done for sure. Now these also date back to about the same time, the 1870s. And you can see they haven't been redeveloped like the rest of the buildings that we've been passing by. They are actually a work in progress. There was just another meeting this past week to discuss what should be done with them. But long story short, it's been sort of a struggle, a tug of war between the owner of the buildings, who would like to develop them in a way to increase their volume, and the City Preservation Board and historical preservationists. So we'll see what happens here. One potential option is that he may choose to preserve the facades of the building and build something taller behind it. We'll see what happens with these, but I also want to point them out because the building right in the middle there, that white one, has a pretty interesting story of its own. Back in the late 19th century, one resident of Austin was a Prussian immigrant by the name of about with malaria. He expanded his business, which was previously selling plants and seeds, and he decided to start experimenting with plant-based medicines as well. So he actually developed his own sort of potion called Microbe Killer that he said would cure all different kinds of diseases and ailments. He said it had worked for him on his malaria, and even though, you know, it didn't have any really scientifically identifiable properties as a medicine, he still managed to sell a whole bunch of it, so much so that by the end of his life he lived in a mansion overlooking Central Park in New York City. But started for him right here in this building on Congress Avenue.
Not to interrupt, there's just a couple people have asked a couple questions.
Yeah.
So Jack, first of all, T, talked about the murals before,
yeah.
So we love them. Jack said that's some beautiful businesses back there. Shannon asked if there are apartments up there on the top.
Oh, yeah, good question.
And as we walk between places, maybe we'll just do a quick check-in with the chat.
Sure.
So that way I'm not bringing us back to where we've already been again.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question about apartments. So some of these buildings do house businesses on their floor and residences above. Others house office spaces above the ground floor buildings. But yes, we will see a few examples of additions. Actually, that building on the corner that houses the Quiznos, I think it is. We can't quite see it now. It's kind of hiding between the brick building, but there actually is one tiny little condo perched up there with a beautiful view towards the Capitol.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, great question.
Lorraine Yusha says, hi Laura.
Hey Lorraine, thanks so much for joining us. Now, as you'll see, some businesses are still kind of boarded up. A lot of people are still working from home around town. So downtown Congress Avenue, we're sort of slowly returning to a state of normalcy, but we're definitely in progress.
It's true. It's true. You're an influencer now. Welcome.
Hey. And then we're going to take kind of a look from a distance at one cool building over that way, Chris, when we get over here. So
it's worth mentioning, how long ago did we meet each other?
Oh yeah, we met, let's see, it's about an hour ago now, 90 minutes.
and how many times did we walk through this route before we did it just now?
None. We're doing this on the fly, you know.
I'm discovering it the same time you guys are discovering it. So I'm sorry if my camera's a little bit behind sometimes.
Thanks, Lenore, for your comments. Seahorse9, if that's you. Now I want to point out, and Chris, get you to zoom in here on that cool building about half a block down the street on the other side there on 9th Street.
The one with the flag outside?
Yeah, that is the old Millet Opera House. Now Austin in its early years had a number of different performance halls housed inside of other buildings, but this was the first really dedicated opera house, theater house. And it hosted not only theater productions, but also all kinds of social. It was really a center of the local Austin culture in the 1880s. But it met its downfall with the advent of electric lighting, because Captain Millet, who owned this opera house, he was a bit old-fashioned, and when electric lights came into style, he absolutely refused to outfit his theater with them. And, well, another man in town, Mr. Hancock, built his own opera house that was very brightly lit and immediately stole all the clientele from the old Millet place. So within a year, the Millet Opera House shut down and then was actually reopened as a skating rink and a storage space for a while. Interesting uses for such a grand building. Now, it was later owned by the Knights of Columbus, the fraternal order, who added that beautiful portico, that deck out front. And nowadays it's owned by the prestigious Austin Club, which is membership of a lot of businessmen, politicians, decision makers around town, and they have tried their best to sort of restore the interior to its former glory. I've never gotten to look inside yet myself, but I hear it's pretty grand.
We could apply to be a server or a cook apparently to hire it.
Oh, yes.
So worst comes to worst.
You know, I've also heard that on their application for new members, they do warn you of the ghost of the old opera house, an actress named Priscilla, who supposedly fell to her death from the catwalk one evening. A story which is a complete urban legend. Now, one thing I love in Austin is that, like any city, we have a lot of great ghost stories.
You're going to get Shannon all crazy. She loves ghost stories.
That's great.
She's going to want to hear a ghost story. You're going to have to tell one.
You know, I've got some up my sleeve. We're actually approaching a good location for a good ghost story here. But of course, you know, one thing that's so interesting about ghost stories is always to see where they come from, if you can even identify that. You know, which ghost stories are really based in historical events, could potentially, you know, have some basis in reality, and which ones are just total inventions. So, you know, it depends. Some stories, some ghosts in Austin do seem to stem from real events, and others it's a little unclear where the tales came from. We're gonna head back across the street here in a second, check out another really cool mural that's a little bit older. That one we saw back down the street was brand new, very fresh. But this one that we're coming up on now, you'll maybe recognize some of the things you'll see in this mural. Oh, here we go. Let's get across the street real quick. Now, this mural that we're coming up to was painted by a local artist named Mouth. And he's a really great person to know in the local art scene. He was the founder of an organization called Spray TX, which provides professional development and all different kinds of resources and support for local artists in town. And this one was actually painted as a part of the 8th Street mural project. So this is a public art project. It's called the Party at the Moon Tower mural. We'll talk in a second a little bit more about what a moon tower is. But first I want y'all to notice that on this mural, you meet probably our most famous local Austinite, Mr. Matthew McConaughey. And actually the mural itself is dedicated to and inspired by the 1993 movie Dazed and Confused, which was filmed here in Austin, directed by Richard Linklater, our darling local film director.
All right.
Absolutely. Now, if you're not familiar with Richard Linklater, you might have seen some of his movies and not known it. Boyhood was one that is a little more recent. Well, not quite recent yet at this point anymore. But one that I definitely recommend checking out is actually his very first movie, Slacker, which is from the early 90s. And there's not a lot of a storyline to it, but it does really give you a good sense of early before the big tech boom began, before the population really started to explode, when it was still a more laid-back city filled with artists and musicians, which to some extent it definitely still is. But the vibe was definitely a little slower paced, a little different back then. So check out Slacker to get an idea of that. You can see our Capitol building here. Now, Mr. Matthew McConaughey, as I mentioned, our most famous Austinite probably, he was born and raised here, got his film degree at UT actually the same year that he starred in Dazed and Confused, shooting him to fame. And he does still live around town. He actually teaches at UT now, a very popular class for film students called From Script to Screen. And actually, coming back this way for just a sec, now we're seeing our moon tower. So Party at the Moon Tower, that's a quote from Dazed and Confused. But what the heck is a moon tower? Well, here we've got one. And if you come to Austin, you will still see about 15 moon towers up around our streets. Now, back in the 1880s, these were kind of considered as perhaps the next big thing in urban lighting. Better than a street lamp, they were very tall. They could light up an entire neighborhood at once. We don't have one right around here that I can show you in real life. But many cities, Detroit, several cities in California, had these installed at the time. However, by the mid-1890s, just a decade later, they were already really starting to fall out of fashion. They were pretty impractical, difficult to maintain, lit with carbon vapor filaments like a gas lamp that had to be replaced every single day. So electricians had to go up all these towers every day in these little pulley elevators, very frightening, and change out those filaments. And once taller buildings were built around them, they really lost their function. But in Austin, our buildings were pretty short. And in the 1890s, and while most other cities took them down, not long afterwards, we kept ours up. And they went from carbon vapor filaments to, of course, other types of lighting over the years. But they did also have their own share of issues. Now, in the movie Dazed and Confused, Party at the Moon Tower, the high schoolers talk about having a party at the Moon Tower. That's a fictional event. But in 1930, there was one 11-year-old boy who was dared by his friend to climb one. He got all the way to the top and then fell all the way down to the bottom. And incredibly, didn't break a single bone. Saved, he actually did end up in a coma for a little bit, but he was totally fine. And by the 1940s, we were the only city to still have them. World War II began. We needed to be able to go dark in case of air raids, and there actually was no way to turn the towers off at that time. So the city did have to do some rethinking. And then by the 1990s, 100 years after we got them, we were the only city in the world. And the question was raised, keep them around or take them down? But the Austinites figured this is one more thing that is now unique and weird to Austin. Let's keep them.
If we see one, I'll camera in on it.
Yeah, we might, there's one a block up that way. But
just as we're going, questions coming in,
yeah.
Or comments. Jack says, fun fact, my dad's neighbor's ex-partner, it was the bouncer in Slacker.
Oh, yay. Yeah, especially people who grew up in Austin, it's definitely not unusual to have some connections. Another really cool piece of street art here that is quite new, actually. This was just installed last summer. It's by an artist named Daniel Horning. And we can see this very bright, psychedelic horse and rider, which he intended to sort of showcase and also to represent the idea that as you approach something you desire, it gets further and further away from you. So we have this beautiful horse and rider here. And we're starting to see definitely increasing amounts of street art of all different types, not just murals, but sculptures like this, other kinds of pieces. So actually, let's take a quick little detour up this way. We'll get a look at a moon tower here for y'all. Now, some of the concerns about moon towers before they were installed didn't turn out to be so much of an issue. But before I tell you about that, I want to forget not to mention real quick that this corner was actually the site of the very first capital of Texas. That 2-room log cabin back in the 1840s was right here on this corner. So not quite the grand spot that our final capital would end up in. But yeah, these moon towers, they were sort of the strange, newfangled. They were concerned that their chickens would get confused. They wouldn't know when to lay eggs. They thought their plants might overgrow and overtake the city. Now, neither of those turned out to be issues at all. But when Austin did decide to completely renovate and repair these moon towers in the mid-1990s, cost them over $2 million and over 2 years as well. So when they finally were finished, they reopened, re-inaugurated the towers with a huge citywide festival. And you will still find a lot of mentions of moon towers around town. We're definitely very proud of them. They're an important part of our local cityscape and culture. So we've got the Moon Tower Comedy Festival every spring. We've got the Moon Tower Saloon, Moon Tower Brass Band, Moon Tower Party Rental Company. Oh, the cidery. Yeah, Moon Tower Cider. That's really good. And so right up this way, we can get a look at one of those moon towers. When you first look at that, you probably wouldn't even really notice it. You think it's a cell tower, radio tower, something like that. But that is a moon tower or a moonlight tower. Unique now to Austin. Like I said, we've got about 15 of those left. And they are now lit by LED bulbs, so they're much more efficient and require a lot less maintenance than in the old days.
Wow. You know, before when you were saying that this was from 1890, I thought you were messed up and meaning to say 1980.
Oh no.
But that's incredible that it really is. I mean, like that
Oh,
does
yeah.
not look like something built, you know, in the 1800s.
No, absolutely not. And you know, like I said, when they first were invented, a lot of people, this is how all of our cities are going to be lit. But that idea definitely didn't last too long. They pretty quickly proved to be too much of a hassle for most of the cities that installed them. But you know, here we love things that are a little bit unique and different. You probably heard our catchphrase, keep Austin weird. And maybe you've wondered where that comes from. You know, who coined that phrase? Well, it actually was started by the Austin Independent Business Alliance back in the 90s. When Austin really began to grow, when its population began to boom, the tech industry was really being drawn here. A lot of locals, of course, were concerned that their small, unique local businesses would be driven out of this really quickly growing city. So the Independent Business Alliance, well, they kind of caught onto this catchphrase, but they actually weren't the first ones to invent it. That was a local librarian who came up with the idea in the first place and started to print bumper stickers at his own home that said, keep Austin, and started to just distribute them around town. It was his way of trying to encourage the locals as the city grew to keep being themselves, keep being unique. But the Independent Business Alliance also kind of took it a step further. They saw it as a way to encourage Austinites to continue to support their unique local businesses too. So they jumped on the bandwagon, started making their own bumper stickers, and took the phrase even more wide. So, you know, other cities have kind of tried to copy us a little bit. You'll hear keep Portland weird these days, keep Louisville weird. But it did originate here in Austin, all with one public librarian.
Teague wants to know, how bright are those moonlights at night? Do they radiate a lot of light, or is it more of a dull hum?
Yeah, you know, these days, of course, they're a little bit mitigated by the fact that we have so many other electric lights, especially right down here in the downtown core. But they are, you know, a moon-like glow. And that's actually exactly what they were said to offer. That's why they were given their name in the first place. Because in the old days of those carbon vapor filaments, they actually did emit sort of a bluish light specifically. The LED bulbs they have today are, you know, a little more white, yellow light. But back in that time, it really was said to be this very sort of calming, soothing, moon-like glow. But yes, they absolutely did light well enough to provide a lot of safety to the nearby neighborhoods. Sure.
Over this.
Yeah.
It's too loud.
And actually, you know, there's a very popular myth around town that we got our moon towers due to our first and most infamous serial killer in town. A man who has been dubbed the Servant Girl Annihilator, who killed, as you can imagine, servant girls primarily in the mid-1880s over the course of about 1 year. His identity is still a mystery to this day. There are a number of different theories out there about who he could have been. But he was, well, he's considered by some to actually be the first serial killer in American history, or at least the first one to get a really catchy name assigned to him, the serial killer, the Servant Girl Annihilator. And he got that name actually from our most famous author in Austin history, who is O. Henry, the short story writer. Now you might think of his name primarily today associated with the candy bar that got named after him, but about 100 years ago, he was actually a house, rather early 1900s. He was one of the most published authors in the United States. He wrote short stories that were syndicated in newspapers all over the country, so millions of Americans read his work 100 plus years ago. He did live here in Austin, and it was in a letter to a friend of his in the summer of 1885 when the Servant Girl Annihilator was active. He wrote to his friend that Austin was pretty quiet over the summer, except for the exploits of the Servant Girl Annihilator, who are keeping people on their toes. So we have him to thank for that catchy name. Just to pop real quick here into the window of Kruger. This is a local jeweler, family owned. They have been open, as you can see, for over 100 years here on Congress Avenue since the 1930s. But you'll see in the window and throughout the store lots of cool historic photos in addition to beautiful jewelry. And I want to point out especially we've got a panorama from 1910. So you can see the Capitol all the way down Congress Avenue to where we are now, and the beautiful Driscoll Hotel off there on the right-hand side. So you can really see how much Austin's grown in the last 110 years. And then next to it, we've got a photo from the inauguration of the Capitol building. As I mentioned, that was completed in 1888 to much affair. They actually organized a whole week of special events and festivities to celebrate the inauguration of the Capitol, and about 20,000 people showed up, which is about twice the population of Austin at the time, actually. So they had to set up these huge campgrounds all over town to accommodate people who were coming from all over Central Texas to come and see this beautiful grand Capitol, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the 7th largest building in the world at the time. So pretty big, pretty street here at some of our beautiful historic old theaters. Now we've got the Paramount Theater here, which originally when it opened in 1915 was called the Majestic. It was a vaudeville theater, and even Harry Houdini once performed there. So in the 1920s it was bought by Paramount Films. So then, of course, it got its name changed, had that beautiful marquee put up, and became Austin's first movie palace. So in the silent film days, sometimes they had just a single organist performing there, but sometimes they had a full-size orchestra, and that's an experience that they actually, on occasion, do recreate for modern audiences today. In 1966, the theater actually hosted the world premiere of the very first Batman movie, and the original Batmobile advertised for the film by driving all day long up and down Congress Avenue. But actually that beautiful marquee disappeared right around the same time. It was taken down to be repaired and then somehow never seen again. And it actually wasn't until 2015 that they finally recreated one, but because they didn't have the original schematics for it, they actually had to rely on archival footage and photographs to do their best to recreate the original. But actually, we're very lucky that this theater is here still today, because by the early 1970s, it actually wasn't in such great shape. The building was really falling into disrepair. They weren't selling enough tickets to the movies to keep it up, and so they actually it was in danger of being demolished. When a couple of local guys teamed up to save it, they started a foundation, collected over $2 million in donations, restored the building, and also brought live performances back. So it does still offer film, but also you'll find dance, music, comedy there, as well as Austin Film Festival, the film branch of South by Southwest. And since I know we have some ghost story lovers here. Really quick, before we go into the next story, two things. First one is how we've gone over an hour. We're an hour and 10 minutes right now, and it might make sense for us to do a pause now to do an episode 1, episode 2. Okay. In case we're going to go for another 30-45 minutes, maybe. Yeah. If we're going to keep on going. Let's do it. And then this is something that we've imagined doing, and we're just going to say this is the end of episode 1. Okay. We're not going to stop streaming. So for all you folks who are part of the live stream right now, don't worry about it. We're not actually going anywhere. We're just going to, we realize that 2 hours is too long for you guys to have to sit and watch a video necessarily. We love the fact that you're live streaming with us and staying right now anyway, so don't go anywhere. We're just going to put in a break that will be deleted out later on, and no one who watches the YouTube video will ever know that this happened. Just you guys know that this happened. That's the end of episode 1 of Best of Austin, and thank you so much. See you guys in episode 2, and then we'll just say welcome to episode 2. All right, great. All right, you guys know what's happening. Here it goes. Thanks so much for joining us let me All right, thank you guys for being part of our production here. Okay, so thanks so much for joining us on episode 1 of Best of Austin.